You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestall. Over the last couple of years, W G Gilbert has built an excellent reputation in the world of the paranormal, both with his brilliant Eerie, Edinburgh YouTube channel and several excellent books. The latest release, Hidden Haunts Island, is another well-researched and wonderfully written collection, pulling another smorgasbord of blood-chilling accounts together for our enjoyment. But before we dive into the book's contents, don't forget you can support Mysteries and Monsters by signing up at patreon.com/mysteriesandmonsters. $4 a month gets you ad-free episodes, guaranteed early releases, bonus content, and more. And you can also click the link in the show notes too. Mysteries and Monsters across most social media platforms. Please subscribe to the Mysteries and Monsters channel on YouTube. And you can also visit mysteriesandmonsters.com for episodes and news. Our exclusive merchandise site is available via TeePublic, and you'll find the link for that in the show notes too if you fancy some merch. And our intro and outro music are performed by the marvellous Weary Pines. Thank you as always to Dean Bestall for his wonderful artwork, and the show is produced by Mr. Brennan Storr from the Ghost Story Guides. Ireland's rich paranormal culture awaits us now, in the company of the marvellous W G Gilbert. The paranormal history of Ireland is far richer than many realise, and thanks to my guest, a collection of forgotten locations and hauntings has been collated in Hidden Haunts Island. Of course, W G Gilbert once again uncovers a ream of supernatural encounters that are often overlooked. Wayne, welcome back to Mysteries and Monsters, sir.
Thank you for having me, Paul. It's a genuine pleasure.
As always, to spend time in your company. I'm going through some kind of strange thing at the moment, Wayne, because I seem to find myself thinking about Ireland far more than I ever have in my life. I've been there a couple of times. I'm not really sure what's going on in my head, but I seem to be developing a real kinship, and I don't understand what's going on because I've got no Irish in my family at all. Not even anybody that turns up on St. Patrick's Day just to get absolutely leathered and pretends to be Irish for a day, or they may have a green shirt and therefore that qualifies them to join in the festivities. So I'm not really sure, but I've always loved Ireland and its history and its rich tapestry and poetry and storytelling and all the wonders that come with it in many aspects of the cultural zeitgeist that Ireland has often found itself as a leading part of. I mean, for yourself, being from Scotland, I suppose that kinship is far stronger because of the Gaelic roots and the connections and the support that you've had for each other. I suppose it's, for many Scots, it's almost like a second home, really, because there seems to be so much in common with each other because of your shared histories and the tumultuous events that seem to have scarred the landscape.
Yeah, although I'm one of the Scots that was quite, I don't know what the correct word is, but quite sheltered from that connection when I was growing up. I had a very Hollywood perspective of Ireland, the cliches, the banshees and the leprechauns and things like that. The first real recollection I have of discovering Ireland was Darby O'Gill and the Little People, the Disney horror film that it is. It's a kids' film, but there's a couple of scenes in it that just terrified me. So that probably scarred me for a wee bit. But I grew up in a family that's really not religious or anything like that. So the obvious connection in Scotland are the two football teams that we have, the Celtic and Rangers,
yes.
The Protestant and Catholic, which is still a thing over here. And it wasn't really until I grew up and I moved out of my house and started to flat share with people who had come to Edinburgh to study. I've shared flats with people from Larne, from Bangor, from Cork, from Dublin, probably all over Ireland. And just, there is, like you say, there's that instant connection that you have with people. I just was instantly attracted to the Irish and the way that they view life and the way that they see things, and you talk to an Irish person, it's like they sing to you, just the lilt in their voice and the stories that you tell you feel like you're learning something of history from them. I can't really explain it, but I just really gravitated towards the Irish people. I ended up going over to Ireland with my friend who was from Larne, 2001, September 2001. We were actually there when the Twin Tower attack happened, which was a strange time for everybody, but strange when we had to try and fly back and things. But seeing the impact it had on the Irish people, they were deeply affected by it. I was just an idiot Scotsman who didn't really know what was going on at all in the world. But to see these guys, I remember watching it in a pub in Galway, I think, and the pub was absolutely silent with the news channel on, and people were just watching these events unfold. And it kind of brought home how the Irish view things, and how warm the people are, and how caring they are. I've got one of my happiest memories was the first night that we travelled. We basically travelled from Larne down what's now called the West Atlantic Way, I think it is, through the Ring of Kerry and down to the southwest coast of Ireland. And the first day that we travelled along the border from Larne to some place. I can't remember where it was, but it was like a scene out of Father Ted. The mist had come in and the road was quiet. There was nobody else on the road, and we were like, we need to find somewhere to stay tonight. And we saw this sign saying caravans 200 yards up the road, and we pulled into this place, and it was a farm, and we knocked on the farmer's door, and his wife answered, and literally two heads popped round at the bottom of the door, and it was the two kids who wanted to see what was going on and who was at the door, and we inquired about the caravan, and she pointed to, like the caravan in Father Ted, that these cows are small, these cows are far away. It was one of those, but they were so welcoming and so friendly to us. Like we were setting up in the caravan, and there was a knock on the door, and it was the farmer who asked if we wanted to go to the pub with them because they were playing the music, as he called it. So we're like, yeah, sure. And we all piled in his car. I think there was about 8 of us in the car, and we must have driven another couple of 100 feet along the road to the pub. And we went in the pub. It was a really old, converted croft building, I think, but had the best atmosphere. We crossed the border, and my friend, this was 2001, so not long after like the Good Friday Agreement and things, and he was from the north, so he was a bit shy about talking with his Northern Irish accent, so I had to do the talking. I went up to the bar to order the second round, and the barman was like, usual, which I just loved. So I just thought it was great. You've only met me once and you already know what my usual is. And then they had a musician playing, and the next thing I heard, I'm shouting, "This is for our Scottish brothers in the back," and he was pointing at me, and he started playing Caledonia by Dougie MacLean, and I was just so touched. I was half cut at the same time, but it was just such a nice, emotional, welcoming moment that I just loved it. And that set the tone for the rest of the journey. And ever since then, I've tried to find out a little bit more about the Irish connections, but it wasn't really until I started to research for this book that those connections really started to show how deep they go, how far back they go, and how connected we still are as countries and as people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on both times that I've been there, I've found it exactly the same. And often you can worry about it, like you say. I mean, it's one of those things, I think, that because of our history, sometimes I think we overthink things. And I've never had a negative experience in Ireland. I love it. I just, like you say, my entire... It would be very easy not to get a warm welcome, and I still did. And I would understand why I didn't. But it was fabulous. And it probably was one of the first times I got absolutely legless on proper Guinness in the afternoon, because in those days we didn't get the proper Guinness. We had the awful pasteurised version here, and going there, it was essentially like drinking alcoholic cream. It was beautiful. And so I got absolutely leathered in the Temple area, and had to go to bed at 8 o'clock for a good sleep.
Yeah, Guinness is. I'm not a Guinness drinker. It's far too heavy. The first time I ever got drunk, I bought myself 6 cans of Guinness, thinking it was lager, not having a clue what it was, and everybody else was sitting pretty drunk, and I was just like, I'm just full. It's just like I've had a big dinner, and I did not enjoy it at all. So, apologies, Guinness lovers. It's just not for me.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it's one of those things. Very, very good for those of us who may have low iron levels. But it is essentially a meal in a glass.
It is, yeah.
A good one. I've had worse.
Yeah.
I suppose as well, as you say in your introduction to this, I think one of the problems we get often with Ireland is a lot of people who aren't Irish or live there or have this connection with the country are very forward in telling us all about the Irish legends and myths. And they tend to focus on 2 things, Wayne, the Banshee and the little people, the Fae, whatever. And it was quite odd because I was online the other day and there was somebody that had shared a story and somebody was on about, oh, well, my grandma told me this story about when she saw a Banshee in a pram. And I thought, hang on, I'm not, obviously I'm not Irish, but I was thinking, are you sure you don't mean a changeling? Am I misunderstanding it? And obviously the person telling this story was Irish, and I thought, well, am I wrong? And I just thought it was a very strange thing, and you see it quite a lot. And obviously Scotland also has a connection with banshees, and obviously people of Irish descent and Scottish descent. This is the thing, you can't sort of get away with it. If you've got that tiny bit of DNA in your family that links back to one of these old curses that banshees in your family tree, doesn't matter how many times you try and dilute that way, that banshee's still got a fix on you if it decides whether you live in England, Scotland, Wales or anywhere else in the world. Yeah,
I thought, to use the term cliche again, I thought it'd be too cliche to go down the Banshee route. I did find a story that is a Banshee story that I thought was a little bit different and was worthy of inclusion. But I figured there's probably hundreds of books out there about banshees written by people who understand and know more about that subject than I do. I was more looking for the ghost story rather than the folklore story. But that's one of the things about the Irish accounts is they are different to the stories that I covered in the Scotland edition and the edition from England. It feels like the other 2 books, to me, the stories felt more like they were tied to the place. So like the stone tape type theory, the replay ghost, that kind of thing. But with the Irish book, there's some of the stories where it feels like, not in the sense of like a poltergeist type connection, but the accounts are connected to that person. The Bunworth Banshee, which I think we're going to talk about later. The Coffin Bearer story, they're just odd stories. They're not. I did find there are some traditional ghost stories in there, but there are some stories that just really baffled me with the content of them. They were very specific to the witness, and sometimes it wasn't quite about the experience that the witness had at seeing the apparition or whatever it was that they saw. Sometimes it was the events that happened afterwards. So more like the death omens, that kind of thing. The death omens seems to be quite a big thing in Ireland. Like you said, Scotland has its own history and folkloric connections with these. We've got the cognac and stuff like that up here. England has its own ones as well, but in Ireland it's very prevalent with the stories that you hear from there. Whatever you search, whatever you read, you'll find stories of death omens, portents, banshees, that kind of thing.
I think one of the things that often differentiates Irish encounters or experiences for me, Wayne, is that there seems to be a far more balanced response to it often. I know there's a couple of cases we're going to talk about where there isn't a balanced response, but they're a little bit different. But often it's always struck me as amusing in a heartwarming way that often, as one of the first stories I want to touch in, which is based in Fitzwilliam Square in Dublin, is often they will consider them to be part of the family, which is an interesting thing because technically, I suppose, they are. They just happen not to be of mortal makeup anymore. They've crossed over into whichever realm they inhabit, and yet, for some people, it doesn't matter. I mean, it's one of those traditions like setting a place for departed loved ones at a family meal or Christmas or the like, Wayne, which is something that seems to have fallen out of fashion these days, sadly. But I would imagine there would still be situations like that occur in certain places, and yet they seem to have a very balanced approach to it. It's not the usual terrifying, everybody's frightened out their wits. Obviously, sometimes you will come across things that will make your blood run cold or whatever, but often, as the pallbearer story that we're going to touch on as well later, the coffin bearer, that's one of those that on first glance you think, yeah, that's terrifying, but then when you take a step back and you think, is it really? Because there seems to be a lot more to that one going on. But as I say, this first one I want to discuss in the wonderful Fitzwilliam Square, which is a place I know because I've been there. Unfortunately, I didn't know there was a poltergeist house there at the time. Otherwise, I'd have hung around and seen if I could see anything going on.
Yeah, I think you're right. Just to go back to your point, it feels like the Irish culture and the Irish people are far more comfortable with the idea of death than most other cultures, and that's why the reactions are different in some of these stories. The Fitzwilliam Square one, as you said, is an example of where it's a figure, I believe it was Lady Reed, was haunting the property, and she was kind of seen as a member of the family, maybe an unwanted member of the family, but definitely a member of the family. She was quite a, you could call it a playful spirit. She had a fondness for hiding shoes, if memory serves. There was an incident with a dress which was laid out, and it was quite a nice dress that was laid out to be used for a function, and that went missing, and then it was found rolled up in one of the rooms at a later date. Noises were quite common, so there's quite a lot of poltergeist type activity with Lady Reed, and that was a story that I found initially through the Society for Psychical Research's archives, and it was again, this is another Scottish connection that was written by a Scottish writer called Annie Swan, and she stayed there while visiting her friends. She was initially sceptical and inclined to dismiss the stories, as most people would be when you hear these things, I imagine. But during her stay, she did experience incidents herself. On her first night, she was woken by a loud noise and found a Venetian blind had been pulled up fully in the room, something that she felt, and she wrote, would require deliberate effort. And the hostess apparently was used to this, and she just remarked, "Oh, it's just Lady Reed," and went back to sleep. So there's that familiarity that you mentioned. Don't worry about it, it's just Lady Reed. Don't worry about it, it's just the dog, or it's just the kids, that kind of thing. Now, I personally, I would have been frightened by that. I don't think I could stay in a haunted house. I'd be curious for a night or two, but I think I would. My bravery would run out soon enough. So yeah, it's a fascinating story.
And I suppose it's one of those as well where you've got such a mix as well in some of these particular areas at that period, where you'd kind of got sort of ancestral Irish blood mixed with British aristocracy. And so you have this sort of very strange relationship that doesn't seem to transfer across the Irish Sea, as it were, Wayne. I've always found it a very refreshing approach to the paranormal. And you have to chuckle because they would basically talk about her in conversation and say, "Oh, you'll never guess what Lady Reed's been up to now. Oh, she's a right mischievous monkey. She's always playing about and whatever." And you're like, this is a very nice kind of, well, we've got a ghost and he's great. We'll just, we like her wandering around the house. And like you say, it's only the visitors that seem to find it a little untoward. But I suppose, what are you going to do if you've got a beautiful townhouse in the middle of one of the most exclusive areas of Dublin at that time? I must admit, it'd have to take one hell of a haunting for me to consider moving out.
Yeah, I guess the thing about the Fitzwilliam haunting is that it doesn't really escalate beyond noises and things happening. If memory serves, there's no apparition. There's nothing scary, really, that happens. And if you're, I guess sort of reflection, if you're in that kind of situation where things just go missing, that's not the worst thing in the world. I'm in a flat where there's been a few odd things happen. I get the occasional double knock on my bedroom door at night. I've not heard it for a couple of years. I used to think it was my daughter. She always used to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning without fail every single night. But then one night I was kind of half awake when it happened, and I opened the door straight away, and there was nobody there. And I've seen some black sandy footprints in my shower. Not long after I moved in, and I guess that was because I was here out of necessity. We'd not long moved in, and I had my 2 kids who were young, and it's not the kind of thing you can start to talk about with them. You don't want to frighten them. So I'm kind of going back on my previous point. I can see why people would stick around if there's nothing, that's jump scare frightening. I did meet up with a couple of friends that I went to secondary school with on Friday there. I've not seen them for about 30 years. And one of my friends, Nicky, was telling me about his wife's house, which is just along the road from another haunting that I've covered in Edinburgh, the Hazeldean Terrace poltergeist. And he was telling me that when he first met her, she told him that their house was haunted, and he's been there at Christmas time, when they've got like Christmas decorations hanging on the wall, heavy Christmas decorations that start swinging, and they have that attitude, don't worry about it, it's just the ghost kind of thing. So yeah, people get used to it. If it's nothing too scary, too frightening, if it's not a 30s drive black monk pulling people downstairs and knocking grandfather clocks, I guess you can learn to live with these things.
Well, it sounds quite pleasant and polite, Wayne, to be honest. It's knocking and it's having a shower, and it's not leaving sandy footprints all over the house, which would be far worse.
True. Yeah.
I suppose as well, there are numerous poltergeist cases from that era in Ireland, which is one of those things, like you say, because they're often claimed as poltergeist, but they seem, as you mentioned there, they seem to be a very steady haunting, and not as malicious as some cases that we're aware of in other parts of Ireland or the UK. That these are fairly innocuous, it would seem. It's bangs and knocks and moving things about, and like I say earlier, just seems to be just mischievous more than anything else, rather than malicious.
Yeah, it does kind of feel like a human personality behind it. Somebody who's lived in that property, who's just going around it like a daily routine. Whereas if you think about stories like the Galway poltergeist, which kind of escalates, and there's quite a lot of violent disturbances with that one. There's umpteen accounts in England, obviously the more famous ones, where we've got talking through children and people floating and things like that. It feels like Lady Reed really is the ghost. She's moving shoes, she's moving dresses, doing the kinds of things that somebody of her position in life would probably do in real life, and she's just kind of carrying it on into the afterlife. So it doesn't feel like it does feel like that human presence rather than a scary spiritual presence, I guess.
With a touch of OCD, it would seem.
Yes.
Well, we mentioned it earlier, and this wonderful story that you've got, The Coffin Bearer, primarily because our main character in it has one of those wonderful... sometimes we struggle with double-barrelled names, but when you get somebody with a triple-barrelled name, you think, hello, what's going on here? Who is the delightfully named Frederick Hamilton Temple Blackwood, which is one of those... It just dates someone. But this is a remarkable story, and as I was sort of alluding to earlier, Wayne, when you look at this story and just read it as it is quite disturbing what goes on and what happens. But as we get to the latter part of the story, where we have a repeat encounter for our hero Frederick, it develops a very different tangent from that point on, because what you may suggest is a portent of doom at the beginning of the story is clearly not what's going on by the end of it. And obviously our hero has a very long and successful life that takes him all round Europe.
Yeah, this was a story that really fascinated me when I read it. It was one of those ones that, when you read this description of what he saw, the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. As you mentioned, Frederick Hamilton Temple Blackwood, What a name. You know, if you ever want to get into writing, then if you call yourself Frederick Hamilton Temple Blackwood, you've got a bestseller on your hands straight away. That's an author's name if I've ever read one. But he was travelling through Ireland, and a delay forced him to stay in a place called Tullamore. And that place has a long history and a strong tradition of folklore, which is tied to warning signs and premonitions. And he was walking through the town in heavy fog one night when he witnessed a strange figure move silently through the street towards him. Thinking it was just somebody human, somebody normal, he kind of kept walking, thought nothing of it. Noticed that the man was hunched over, and then as he got closer, he saw he was carrying a small coffin in his arms. But what was the most frightening aspect of it was when he was able to discern the figure's hands. They were pale, withered, and, as he described, corpse-like, as if they were taken from a dead body and attached to this figure's hands. And before he could say anything, before he could act, the figure just vanished into the fog. So, you know, that's quite a different kind of apparition to see. It doesn't feel like it's just a replay of somebody enacting something that really happened. It's an odd circumstance to be carrying a small coffin. You could kind of understand if that was real, you know, if somebody was carrying a small coffin, if it was the coffin of their child or something, that would leave an imprint on the place. But how does that explain the withered corpse-like hands that this person had that seemed to be, you know, alien to the rest of the body that the guy saw? But he tried to dismiss it. He'd been travelling a lot, so he thought it's either exhaustion or just his imagination. But around 20 years later, while he was attending a social gathering in Paris, so a different country entirely, he saw the same figure again, unchanged, and walking below a balcony that he was standing on, and it was still carrying the coffin, still had the same hands. But this time, the figure appeared to acknowledge him, and it raised one of its dead hands in a beckoning gesture towards him before it disappeared once again. So, as you can imagine, that left him pretty shaken, and he left Paris the next day. It wasn't too long after that he learned that the house where he'd been staying had collapsed and it killed several people. And had he remained, he probably would have died in that accident as well. So a lot of I like this story because this was a warning to the person that saw it. A lot of the stories that you associate with Ireland, like the banshees, you hear the wail, the keening of the banshee, and it's linked to somebody in the family will die. But this seemed very specific. The second encounter was very specific to Frederick. And that, to me, made it stand out a little bit. Plus the creepy dead hands as well, and the coffin, I just thought was very unusual.
Very much so. I mean, there's occasional stories like this where people see a ghost that seems to be a protector, a messenger of safety, as it were. Because clearly, if Frederick hadn't seen this thing in Paris, he'd be dead. It's quite obvious. But he had such a visceral response to seeing this awful thing again, in his opinion. And it would, when you look at it afterwards, you think, well, clearly that saved his life because it scared him enough to make him leave as though he was running away from it. Whereas one would suggest that if this thing was a portent of doom, it probably wouldn't have appeared, Wayne. It would have left him there. And you would think perhaps this is one of those sort of generational guardian spirits or protectors of a family that occasionally you will come across in certain areas in the UK where there's like a family spirit or a portent of protection that comes around when people are ill or there's been a tragedy or whatever, and it's almost as if it's there to give them comfort. And it would be interesting to be able to speak to this chap back in those days after the Paris incident to see how it changed his opinion, because clearly how he viewed it the first time was quite frightening, and as you say, the description seems to be terrifying. That yes, it's strange enough to see this sort of wizened thing walking through a graveyard with the tragically small coffin in its arms, but the hands that are almost like talons or that of a corpse when they're all shriveled up and bent and twisted. And I suppose it's one of those that even in the paranormal, we should never judge a person by appearance, really. It's what's inside that matters. And clearly, despite this apparition's wizened and terrifying appearance, it had good intentions in its heart because it saved his life.
It's a very good point. Yeah, I mean, the Irish obviously have a strong belief in forewarnings. And what better way to frighten somebody away from a place is to appear frightening. To carrying a coffin signifies death. The corpse-like hands, also another symbol of death, I guess. And if it can't connect in another way, then it has to frighten the person to move on from the location. And whatever it did, it's worked because he, like you said at the start, he survived to live a long life afterwards.
It would have been intriguing, I suspect, for him if he'd had the foresight to perhaps look into his family tree and see if there was a tragic accident where a child had died, perhaps in a collapsing building, Wayne, maybe, and that's whatever. This spirit knew that down the line, Frederick was going to find himself in a similar situation, and he must have thought, I don't want that to happen to any other member of my family because of how it affected him, clearly.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah,
I suppose, as you say there, Irish ghost stories do have a lot of these sort of forewarnings, whereas traditionally people, as you say, focus on the banshee and essentially once you hear that or see it, all bets are off, really. It's just a case of, is it going to be me or is it going to be somebody I really care about? It's just, it's a bit of a spectral Russian roulette, it would seem, as to who gets claimed. And I remember once speaking to a friend of mine, as I mentioned earlier on, about people trying to sort of dilute their Irish ancestry. And the family name is Dornan, which is a very long-standing Irish name. Obviously, quite a famous actor, Jamie Dornan, is part of that family tree. And obviously they're moved over and they've been in England a very long time. And I remember one Christmas having a few drinks and they lived in they still do live in a bit of a haunted farm in Derbyshire. And they were adamant that it couldn't be anything to do with their Irish ancestry, because they married in, they'd been in England about 100 years now, and they were English. And I said, well, technically, I suppose you are, but I don't think that's how the banshee works, guys. And I just keep your cards close to your chest. Don't get too overconfident here.
Yeah, I mean, the banshee story that I feature in the book is it's kind of a traditional banshee story. Somebody hears the wailing of the banshee and it's linked to a death later on. But the twist is that you normally associate a banshee with the Gaelic families, sorry. But this guy, he didn't have that Gaelic blood. He was a Protestant minister, if memory serves. So it's a very unusual banshee story. But yeah, I did read a lot of banshee stories when I was researching this, and I did swither about having a chapter in there about them. But I went against it. But when you read them, some of them are frightening. There is a bit of a story that's not quite a banshee in the book. The title of the story escapes me, but it was a 19th century house, and the family heard three whales, and it was linked to the death of one of the children. But again, they didn't have a history of a banshee. Like I think it's the Kennedys have a banshee associated with them. There is a story about one of the places where the Kennedys stayed in the book as well. Not a banshee story, but a fascinating story. So it's something I would, from a personal perspective, I don't think it's right for me to cover this kind of thing. I would love to find out a little bit more and dive into that subject a little bit more. It's not something I'm particularly strong with. But having covered some similar stories in Scotland, like there's a story, the manse in Durness in the north coast of Scotland was haunted by what they thought was a cognac, which resulted in the death of one of the priests that lived there. There are obviously connections there, and that part of Scotland as well has a strong roots with Irish settlers coming over and settling in the north of Scotland. I don't know a lot about banshees. What I have read is absolutely fascinating, and it's something I want to learn a wee bit more about.
The thing about them that I've always been really intrigued about is I wonder how many Irish-American banshee stories we have, because obviously, as you say, that there's been a long tradition of Americans coming back to Ireland to reconnect with their roots, and it's a matter of fact the amount of Irish that moved over there, and settled all over. You can see it into the modern era. Ironically, some of New England's most famous locations have extremely strong ties with Irish tradition and history, even down to the sports club. I mean, the Boston Celtics are probably the primest example of that kinship that still goes on even into the modern era there. And so I can't really remember, Wayne, actually coming across any sort of Irish American banshee stories, but I would imagine, going on what we both know about the paranormal, I would be amazed if there aren't any. It just seems that we don't hear about them for some reason.
Yeah, as you're talking about it, there is a spark of recognition in my brain. I'm sure I've heard something along these lines on maybe like something like Jim Harold's podcast, where he's had episodes around those. There definitely will be stories out there. The connection with America and Ireland is strong. It's the same with Scotland as well. There are apparently more people of Scottish blood in America than there are Scottish people in Scotland. With the Highland and Lowland clearances, a lot of people emigrated over to America and Canada as well.
Yes.
So there have to be cases out there.
Absolutely. Well, Nova Scotia is a prime example once again, eh?
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
And it's one of those things, you can tell a lot about some of these places where people have settled and stuff, because there is still that tradition, and a lot of them had used brought the names of the towns, the villages, whatever, settlements, and even in certain parts of the States, you've got places that are basically transplanted whole regions from England, it would seem, and named all their towns about it. I remember doing an interview with a UFO experienced, Tom Reed, who famously appeared on a recent episode of the New Unsolved Mysteries, and every part of where he lives is all based around here. It's all Sheffield and Hillsborough and Stocksbridge. And I was like, this is crazy.
Yeah, there's an Edinburgh. I think it's pronounced Edinburgh, though. Which is...
like that famous clip.
Yeah. There are so many places over there that are linked to places over here. It's great. One of the good things about the audience that I have is the bulk of them are from America, and they love the history that I bring to the episodes that I do on YouTube, especially the Scottish episodes. And I get so many people getting in touch with me saying that they're coming over, they want to visit these places. Can I recommend places? There's a definite real passion from Americans to discover their Irish or Scottish roots. It's really nice, really nice.
Absolutely. I completely agree. It's edifying to see that people still want that connection, and long may it continue. Like I say, sadly, there doesn't seem to be any in my family. I don't know what's going on, but you never know. I'm yet to take the plunge into a DNA test. I could end up finding out that I'm like third generation Irish, because I've never met my father, so I have no idea, Wayne.
So I did one a couple of years ago, and I expected to have quite a lot of English in me.
Yeah.
But I know these things aren't an exact science. I thought it was a bit of a chuckle. I was something like 81% Scottish or Celtic. I have about 7% Scandinavian. I'll get my maths wrong here, but I have more Iberian in me than English, and I have a little bit of English and some Central Asian in me as well. So, been all over the world. Right? Kind of a Highland warrior, an Iberian prince, an English lord, and a Central Asian warlord, something like that. That's how I imagine my ancestors to be.
Clearly, you're one of Genghis Khan's relatives, then.
Yeah, that's. As soon as I saw it, that's what I thought.
If not, I'm sticking with it. It's one of the greatest statues in the world. That in Mongolia, it's incredible. I'm amazed more people don't know about that. That's one of those things you just got to try and get to. I think sometimes, other than the Gobi Desert, if you can avoid the Mongolian death worms, of course.
Yes. Yep.
And so it kind of, like you say, one of the stories in there, I think, is one of those that. In your book, it's entitled The Thing That Followed, because this is one of those famous occasions where it seems that people are haunted rather than the location, which we do get across sometimes. But it seems to be one of those things that I'm still surprised often catches people unawares when we talk about people being haunted rather than a location or a building or the land itself. Because you don't often get hauntings that follow families. And this is probably one of the the best examples in regards to distance that you can have, and also one that obviously quite fancied going to see as well. But it's one of those stories that it seems to have about 10 different names for it. And I think the problem with this particular one is, I think it depends on who finds it in what book, because I know it as 3 different stories, because it is known as different things, because obviously this is all to do with Bridget Murphy and her family who lived in this farmhouse. And I've seen it described as the Murphy Polt, the Cunun haunting, the ghost that wouldn't leave. So it's a mysterious one, because when you get down to it, it's a very unnerving story, as we were saying about some of these not being too frightening or anything. This is one of the examples where we've got a real terrifying spectre terrorising this poor widow and her children, because one of the key aspects of this is obviously the husband's died. And I often like these kinds of very strange explanations that people said, well, they're all grieving, so they probably don't understand what's happening, which I'm thinking, well, yeah, people are sad and upset when they lose someone, but they don't start thinking their house is haunted, for goodness sake.
Yeah, it doesn't explain the visitor experiences as well. There were people that came and witnessed events also. Yeah, like you said, this is around a woman called Bridget Murphy, whose husband died in 1907. It's kind of a traditional poltergeist case to a point. What creeped me out about this, I kind of like to imagine what the families or what the witnesses go through when I'm writing about things. I've got quite a vivid imagination. And when I was researching this story, I obviously was on Google Maps and things like that to try and find the place, because it's not a hidden haunting by any stretch. It's in the local area in Ireland. It's quite a well-known case, but it's one that I'd only discovered when I started researching this. But the property is quite remote. It was previously surrounded by woods off a main road. I think the woods have been cut down now. But if you go back to 1907, 120 odd years ago, this would have been a very rural property. And it's just a mother and her kids living in this property, and these strange events start happening. It's the usual progression of a poltergeist case. If you go with Evelyn Hall's 7 stages of poltergeist activity, it started with knocking at the door late at night. Not frantic knocking, but a very deliberate knocking. And obviously you're going to go and answer the door, and when they did, nobody was there. But not long afterwards, the knocking spread from beyond the door to the windows and to the walls, and it started to move around the house as if somebody was circling round the house. If you can imagine, in the middle of the night, you're a single mother with your children in the middle of nowhere. That's going to absolutely terrify you. It doesn't feel like a product of grief. That feels very real, very frightening. So that continued for a period, and then they started to hear footsteps in the hayloft above the cottage. I've seen a video of the location. One of these urban explorers went in, and it's quite a different property. It's not like a cottage. If memory serves, it's part barn, part cottage. Yeah. So you can only reach it from the outside. But remember, we are in the middle of nowhere here. So you would hear, if it's somebody on a horse or a horse and cart, you would hear them approaching. And these footsteps were heard in the hayloft regularly. People go up and check, and there's nothing to be seen, but they could still hear the footsteps. And as time went on, the activity intensified, as a poltergeist case sometimes does. Plates and household objects began to move on their own. Sometimes they'd lift into the air and smash against the walls. Beds reportedly rose off the floor at night and then dropped back down. And this really reminded me of the Rerick poltergeist case in Scotland from the 1700s. Furniture shifted, doors rattled. The family then started to hear music, including what they described as patriotic songs. So the furniture continued to shift, doors rattled, that kind of thing continued, kept happening, and the atmosphere in the house changed as well. Visitors described the place as heavy and oppressive, and people were reluctant to come alone due to that. Some of the neighbours would stay, and they left shaken and refused to return. Eventually, the local priest, a Father Eugene Coyle, he came and visited the house, and he reported strange sensations and unexplained movements that he later then returned to perform an exorcism. which at that time in Ireland was extremely rare. The ritual failed, and the activity afterwards became worse. As you can imagine with these kind of things, it happens like the Socky poltergeist case, the Battersea poltergeist case. Rumours started to spread. At that time, the family were accused of witchcraft. Bridget's son was said to possess a forbidden book. There was no evidence to back that claim up. It was just the local gossip, and the community turned against them. It was about 1913, Bridget decided that she'd had enough, and she decided she was going to flee Ireland with her children. She first came to Scotland, didn't last long in Scotland, unfortunately, and then decided that she was going to go to America. The creepiest detail I find about the case was that it followed them. So we go from a typical poltergeist haunting or case to, as you said in the intro to this story, the haunting that follows, the thing that follows, the thing that followed the family. When they were on the ship, there was knocking and unexplained sounds. And it got to a point that it was so bad that the captain of the ship threatened to put to port and kick them off the boat because they didn't want to have this activity happening on that boat. Eventually, the activity faded when they got to America, but that damage remains. Her reputation was tarnished. It spread across to America. It followed her there. So it's a kind of a tragic story because it started with a tragedy of the husband dying, and then things just went from bad to worse from them, to the point that they had to flee, and it followed them.
I think as well, what marks this one out as quite a strange one is, as you would imagine, especially at that period of time, that the fact that trying the exorcism and it didn't work, and they tried it again and it didn't work, and they came back and it still didn't work, and if anything, it seemed to enrage whatever was there, because every time they try something, the responses seemed to get worse and worse and worse. And also the fact that one of the daughters was so traumatised even by going to America, she still couldn't get over what had happened and ended up being institutionalised. And I suppose sometimes, as you say there, about people claiming that the family was still practising witchcraft and having forbidden knowledge and all that. And then when you say, actually, we're talking about a case that's just over 100 years old, people would say, what? How could people have this? But then again, you look at certain incidents. I mean, the very famous Changeling case isn't too far behind that. And I think it's one of those things that, depending on certain locations in Ireland at that time, they were still very traditional in regards to how they viewed the church and the dark powers. And I suppose what we would consider the modern age, in certain areas, some of these old beliefs about witchcraft and silly books were still very prevalent in whispered conversations behind closed doors, Wayne.
Yeah, these things still go on. I can remember when I went to school, there was a house that I used to walk past. We called it jokingly the Scabby House. It was a strange house. The road that I walked to school, every house had a green hedge. When you got to the Scabby House, the hedge turned brown. And when you got past the Scabby House, it turned green again, exactly at the boundary of the Scabby House. And people used to, like the grown-ups, used to talk about black magic and witchcraft and things being done in that house because of the colour of this hedge. It was viewed as being different. They just couldn't get their heads round why this hedge would be different. It had to be done by some curse or something like that. And, you know, it's only 100 years ago, but if you think about the advances in science and just understanding and coping with grief and things like that we've had in that time, we obviously wouldn't think these things now. We would then, because people just didn't understand it. And rather than trying to understand it, you blame the victims. It's just human nature at times. You have to find the cause of it, and the cause, if you don't understand, must be something that they're doing rather than something that's being done to them. I'm sure if these events happen now, it would be very different. There would be a lot of support functions for the family in the first place to be able to cope with that grief. And even to your point at the beginning, where the family were grieving, and at times it was blamed on that grief, they were just not understanding it. If this is a result of the grief that the family were feeling, then that's just as fascinating as a poltergeist, you know, this mischievous spirit that comes in and moves plates and things. If these guys, through their raw emotions, are causing these things to happen, then that is absolutely incredible and fascinating.
Very much so. Very much so. And it does seem to be one of those, like you say, that we've got this poor family who are stuck in this awful, awful situation. And it didn't seem, like you say, they just had to leave to get away. I think more so, not necessarily to try and escape whatever had moved in with them, Wayne. I think that they realised that all the bridges in the community had been burnt because they've become pariahs, for better or worse, through no fault of their own.
Yeah, when public perception turns against you, there's not much you can do. That old saying, tried in the court of public opinion. It's just unfortunately human nature. The best thing for them, like you said, was just to try a new life. A couple of times it didn't work in Scotland, so they tried the new world where the streets are paved with gold and things. And thankfully, apart from the daughter that you highlighted, it did turn out to be a semi-happy ending for the family after everything that they'd been through.
Well, I think we should move a little further up the country now, because we've got this wonderful story from Strabane, which is one of those places that it gets a bad press, that place. I've seen it described horrifically over the years, and often by people who don't seem to have any sort of cultural intelligence in regards to its position and the reasons why, Wayne. However, Strabane is one of those places that has one of those really weird historic parts to it, because the guy that ended up moving to America, I think his name was John Dunlap, who was a printer. He's the guy that printed off the Declaration of Independence in the States. He's probably the most unrecognised party to all that history tied up in America and the signatures and everything. He printed it. He printed the document that they all signed. And his little shop in Strabane, I think, is still there. It's still protected. I think the National Trust own it or something now. And you say these things to people. I'm not really sure why it's not more well known. However, going on what seems to be happening in a lot of the roads in the area, perhaps that has something to do with why not many people want to go there, because they're not sure what they might visit on what seems to be known as the local ghost roads. Yeah,
so I covered the A75 in Scotland.
Yes.
When I was writing the book. So that kind of made me think, is there an equivalent in Ireland? It turns out there is, and that's the ghost road in Strabane. It's one of similar to the A75. It's not just like Bluebell Hill, is it, in England, where
yes.
You've got the apparition of the young lady. There are many different things that happen on this stretch of road. It's not a particular corner or anything, it's a stretch. Like the A75, there's all sorts of different hauntings on the A75. There's animals that are flung towards the cars. There's Victorians seen walking along the roads. It's a very strange place, and the same with Strabane as well. And I think that probably the most vivid historical report comes from October 1913 at the old railway station. The workers there reported loud knocking and what they described as like unearthly cries around midnight. When they opened the shed, they claimed that they all saw a heavy-built figure in the yard screaming and moving with a kind of like a frantic purpose. Now, when you hear that, you kind of think that's just somebody's had a couple of pints of Guinness too much Guinness, or somebody's having a bit of a breakdown, something like that. Mm. But they approached, one of them had a crowbar, said he tried to strike it, and when he did, the crowbar passed right through the guy as if he wasn't solid. Not long afterwards, they reported that the tools in the shed were rattling and clothing was then being thrown about. So you've got an apparition and then poltergeist activity. A very strange account. By the second night, several of the men were said to have witnessed the same disturbances. So it's not just the people on the first night. This is an ongoing thing that more and more people are seeing. They were never able to confirm who the figure was, but it was, as many of these stories are, that it was linked to a death on the railway previously. Then you've got areas like Stumpy Brae, where it's said that a peddler was murdered and he was badly mutilated by his murderer, and his ghost was said to return as a vengeful presence, which, if I was murdered and badly mutilated, I would probably be pissed off and want to come back and get a wee bit of vengeance on anyone that passed. So the kind of thing with him is that the people who pass that area hear knocking at the hour that the guy was said to have been murdered, and the lore of the area is that his spirit is still tied to this place, and they still hear the knocking. Then there's an account near a place called Carricklee, which is outside Strabane, where a man was out shooting around about midnight, and he described what sounded like musket fire, shouting, and he doesn't really explain how, but he had the impression of burning in flames. And then he claimed that he saw ghostly cavalry charge past and a battle scene that appeared in front of him and then vanished. I love a battlefield ghost, like Killiecrankie and Edge Hill in England and stuff like that. I love these stories. But he was able to later on connect that story to a specific historical attack on his family's home. So he interpreted that as like a traumatic event from his family's history replaying in the landscape around him. Again, it goes back to what we were talking about at the start of the story, at the start of the chat. These stories don't particularly feel just like replays of events that happened. They feel kind of linked to the people in some way, and that I think kind of epitomizes that. There are still variations of the same themes as that. You see figures by the roadside, a real feeling of being followed along the road. And there's places where horses and dogs refuse to pass, which reminds me of where my parents used to live up in Rannoch. There's a ghost stone where it said that the old postman from a couple of 100 years ago, his horse wouldn't pass it because it was startled by an apparition that appeared out the stone. And then there's things like funeral horses stopping at the same bend and then walking backwards and needing the horses' heads covered before they'll move on, kind of similar to the Rannoch story that I mentioned there. So
yeah,
it's one of these, it's not a specific individual ghost, it just feels like a very haunted stretch of roads, but with some of these hauntings tied to the people that witness them.
I think the thing that strikes me about it is that it's one of those places, it would seem to me, Wayne, where it depends on the person there rather than whatever ghosts are lurking, because there seems to be such a wide variety of experiences from people from all different backgrounds and cultures, I would imagine, that it seems to be whatever the person there is, because often, as you mentioned there, Bluebell Hill, Stocksbridge Bypass here in Sheffield is another one, A75. You have a specific type of haunting there. I mean, Stocksbridge is one of those that the version people tell doesn't bear much resemblance to what's actually been reported over the years. There is a bit of variation about it. It's not just this monk-like figure that wanders about, but people don't seem to care about witnesses. They just want to keep telling the same cliched version of it. This is one of those where, as you say, you've got such a wide variety of stuff going on, from feelings to replays to odd creatures and dead animals. It's just an odd place. Some would say it's one of those places where the reality of our world meets the reality of whatever else is going on, and therefore the missing ingredient is the person that has the experience, because it's not a one-size-fits-all, sadly, it would seem.
Yeah, that's I hadn't actually thought of it that way, but that's a really interesting way to position it and to think about it. I guess, roads do seem... You've mentioned a couple here. I'm a big fan of the Stocksbridge Bypass stories. I love them. I think they're very creepy. Whether I've heard the correct stories that you've mentioned or whether I've heard the rehashed versions, I don't know. So you'll need to point me in the direction of some sources where it's an accurate retelling. But yeah, I covered the A9 as well, going up the road to the Highlands, and there are some good stories associated with that. And if you go a little off the road, you don't have to go far off the road. You've got stories of vampires and, again, cognacs, witches and things like that. And it feels like roads, people travel the roads, the stories travel the roads. These are kind of liminal spaces. And they don't really lend themselves well to traditional hauntings in the most part, just by the very virtue of being a pathway. You're getting from point A to point B. I don't know how to explain what's in my head properly, but I've never really the stories that I've researched and covered, the road stories are very odd and very different. And it's fascinating. And it could be down to the individual perception of what's happened and things like that, like you mentioned. It could be down to that person's experiences in life causes them to see things differently. It's all very fascinating stuff.
It is, because I've always pondered those kinds of things, Wayne. Like, I'm always intrigued where you have, say, a group of 30 people walking around a stately home or something, and 2 people see something and nobody else does. And I think, well, what makes those 2 people different? And I start to think about, are they left-handed? What star sign are they? What blood type are they? When were they born? What's their cultural background? What's their genetics? And I start to think perhaps far too much into why. But it also, when you get a location that has such a variety of events being reported, and as you say, it is quite strange. There are these little pockets somewhere in Britain and Ireland where we have these bits where there seems to be a lot going on, and not everybody seems to see the same things. You could probably say that's what's going on on the east coast of England, and some of the work that Paul Sinclair and his colleagues are doing, because there's a lot of weird things going on there. There's people seeing ghosts and strange lights and USOs and missing time, and people claiming to see what we would describe as werewolves wandering around. And yet you think, what, all in one area? But then, having been there, and my misfortune is I drove through the Highlands of Scotland when it was probably the greatest summer they'd had up until that point. So for me, it was one of the most beautiful experiences of my life, because I drove all the way from Glasgow to Inverness, and then we came back down the west coast and went back into Glasgow and spent 10 days just travelling all the way around it. And it was glorious sunshine. I ended up sunbathing on the banks of Loch Ness, which I don't think many, even Scottish people, can claim to have done, Wayne. And it was glorious. It was beautiful looking at the rolling. It was picture postcard beautiful. It's one of the most special journeys and holidays I've ever had in my life. It really gave me a real appreciation for Scotland and the Scots. When I saw it like that, it looks like heaven on earth, and I understand why people have such strong ties to Scotland when you wander through it. However, doing that journey probably in January, when it's absolutely tipping it down and blowing a hoolie, I think would give me a very different interpretation and feeling inside my heart.
I'm going to disagree with you there. Scotland in every season is worth travelling. The area that you talked about there up the west coast is incredible. Obviously, it's better in the summer. Yes. The beaches, you could be mistaken for thinking you're in the Caribbean until you get in the water, and then it's like you've got ice cream headaches in your feet. But yeah, the North Coast in particular. I've done the book on the North Coast 500, covering the folklore and the hauntings up there, and that's another stretch of road. There are areas up the west coast around about Storr and Achmelvik and Clashtall where there's dozens of stories, and you don't have to go far around to get to like Sandwood Bay, which has a famous ghost story associated with it, which could just be people seeing the hermit that lived there and thinking he was an apparition. To get round to where I mentioned previously, where you've got Durness, that whole area is just filled with stories, and they're not all traditional ghost stories. I wrote in the book about this strange dog that was seen in Storr. It was bigger than an average dog. I think it had antlers and it had a bit of a human face and flames coming out of it as well. Now that's not an apparition of somebody standing by the side of the road. That's a very strange apparition. It's not one that I'm not massive on folklore. It's not my area of expertise, but it's not something I've come across anywhere else in any part of the UK either. And again, that was spotted in the middle of the roads. So these roads seem to have this strange phenomena associated with them. You've got the Bonnybridge Triangle. That's area of concentrated weirdness as well, like you mentioned about Paul Sinclair. I love his channel. I love his enthusiasm for the subject. He's fascinating. It just feels like we're in a very strange world, and there are certain areas that are stranger than most.
Absolutely. I remember when we went to visit Eilean Castle, which is famous for obviously being in Highlander, I think is what put that on the cultural map. And I remember going there. I mean, this is that just shows you how nerdy I am. That I made sure that there were two things I definitely wanted to do on my trip, was go to Loch Ness and go to the castle from Highlander, which shows two very different sides of me, I think, Wayne.
Yeah, Island Donan is a great castle.
Yes.
I was a wee bit disappointed to learn that it was rebuilt in, I think, in the 30s.
Yeah.
It was a ruin before that, but fair play to the guy who rebuilt it. It was destroyed by the English after the Battle of, was it Glenshee in 1715? When the Scots...
That's unusual for the English at that period.
Yeah. The Scots and Spanish troops were defeated by the English, even though we had the high ground. Yeah. You guys deployed mortars on us and just ruined us.
Hey, don't drag me into this. I know my history. That's why I'm always respectful.
Yeah. But there are so many castles up that way that are just picture postcard. Ardrech Castle, Kilhurn Castle, places like that, filled with stories, filled with ghost stories as well. So, as a person who writes about and tells ghost stories, I'm very, very lucky to live in this country.
You are indeed, and it's wonderful that you take us there. I think the last encounter we need to touch on before we have a chat about some exciting new projects you've got in the file, is this Banshee story that we touched on, the fact that we've included it because it's slightly different, because it is, and it's also very unusual because we've got this guy who's front and centre of this particular experience, who also seems to be quite different because he seems to like being in Ireland. He seems to feel at home there. He mentions that he enjoys the customs, he likes the music, and you can see that some of his colleagues in the clergy clearly don't share those opinions. I would imagine there was this kind of intellectual bollocks that they had towards traditional Irish culture at that point. I'm sure they would class it as increasing their IQs or intelligence, or dragging them into the modern age, as it were, Wayne, which is quite ironic how it seems to be not that way out. And yet here this guy is, he's just like, what the hell is going on here? And I think sometimes when you get these kind of stories with, especially for the period of time, what seem to be very learned men of the cloth, because often we come across these stories and they seem to fall into cliches and it's always the devil or witchcraft or whatever. Our guy here seems to be there's a bit more about him.
Yeah, like you said, he was a musician. He played the fiddle. He supported the local musicians, the harpers. And he tried preserving that culture as much as he could and engaging with the local people. He was well liked. He was an Anglican clergyman, and he lived near a place called, and I will butcher the pronunciation, so apologies. I'm going to call it Buttevant. Buttevant. So if there are any people who are listening who know that pronunciation, please accept my apologies for that. But he lived there in the late 18th century, and he was widely respected, not just by Protestants, but also by the local Catholic population as well, because of the effort, like you said, that he went to ingratiate himself with them and just learning the traditions and the music and everything. He was a man who was known for his fairness, he was generous, and he had just this deep love of traditional Irish music. But yeah, he is associated most famously with a banshee, and he fell seriously ill, and there was a servant named Kavanagh who was sent out late at night to fetch medicine. And while he was walking through a glen, he heard a woman's voice keening or wailing beside him, and it was low and mournful and unmistakable that it was a grief-stricken sound. He couldn't see where this noise was coming from, but he was certain that this woman that he could hear was walking with him the entire way. The distance of the noises didn't change. He could hear clapping. It was like she was clapping her hands in sorrow and calling Bunworth's name out loud. The sound only stopped when he neared the ruins of an old abbey. When he reached the house, he was clearly shaken by what he'd heard, and he was told not to speak of what he'd heard. But at night, the sound returned, and this time it was outside the house itself. And many people heard the sounds. They heard the clapping. They heard moaning beneath the parlour window where Bunworth lay sleeping. people rushed outside, naturally. They wanted to see what was going on. They found no footprints, no disturbance, no sign that anybody had been there. But the sounds continued until dawn. And by dawn, Bunworth was dead and the sounds had stopped. And I think, for me, what made this story kind of exceptional is that it breaks almost every rule associated with Banshee lore, apart from a death. As we kind of touched on, the Banshee is more traditionally linked with old Gaelic families, yet Bunworth was a Protestant minister of English descent, and still the Banshee came from. So it's a really unusual account, and one that I just felt, as much as I tried to stay away from Banshees, I felt this one was different and warranted some inclusion.
Absolutely, like you say, it breaks every rule in the Banshee portfolio, because what on earth has this guy got to do with the Banshee and the traditions and the Gaelic blood? Now, you might surmise, Wayne, that perhaps down the line, maybe this chap has got some Gaelic blood in him down there. Or you could look at it and think he was so widely respected in the community that maybe even the Banshee accepted him.
Yeah, it does feel more like that's the case, that he'd kind of earned, rather than being able to trace back to some Irish heritage, it feels like the effort that he put in to learning and falling in love with the customs and the people that he was surrounded by, it felt earned rather than just heritage.
Very much so. Though, is that really a reward any of us want? To be that well liked that even the Banshee says, yes, I'm going to come and terrify him when he's about to pass?
I don't know, a good sending off from a Banshee.
Well, true.
It's still being talked about hundreds of years later. Sounds pretty good.
It is, and it is remarkable that you've got this tradition of keening that occurs in Scotland, Ireland, and I've read very old reports from Wales as well. And it'd be interesting to I'm going to set myself a task there. I'm going to dive into it, because I know obviously keening is one of those things that seem to have died out, and obviously in the revival in the modern era of, as we were saying, about people reconnecting with their past and their cultures and things, keening really seems to be one of those folk traditions that has returned in some level, and people have recorded modern interpretations of them or done cover versions of traditional Irish and Scottish keening songs. And so I think it shows testament that even in the modern era where we've gone through the Industrial Revolution, people have still been able to still have these touchstones to the previous times where these things were front and centre for most cultures and communities in those areas, and regardless of where they were in those particular countries. And so it for me it's one of those vitally important cultural celebrations or aspects of grief and mourning and loss that I think it's important that we still have that connection with those beliefs and that because having heard some over the years and some of the traditional interpretations and recordings from the beginnings of the 20th century that were done by some sort of folklorists and cultural historians, Wayne, it's terrifyingly beautiful music.
Yeah, we are, I think, rediscovering this past that we were in danger of losing. The more we kind of are being cut off from the old ways in the natural world, the more people are pushing back against it. You know, I at heart, I'm an old indie boy. I love my mid-90s Britpop music, but these days I listen to the music that my grandparents listened to, and the impact that it has on me, it just calms you, it just grounds you, it just makes you feel. I don't want to sound like an old hippie with this, but it just makes you feel connected to your history. And I think people are realising that these things, people sang these songs and had these traditions and this folklore for a reason. And it wasn't just because we were a more primitive people at the time. It was because of the connections that it made with the community. You know, we've lost that a lot over the years. And this is something that it comes true when you do any kind of research into the Irish folklore and stories, or even if you visit, like we were talking about at the start, when you visit Ireland, the community, the sense of purpose that people have, and the sense of togetherness is huge. Being an Edinburgh boy in a city that I love, and I often don't think I could ever leave Edinburgh. You just don't have that connection. It just feels like there's a big section of people that need to have these things again, and I feel like I'm one of them, that I need that connection to the way that we used to live and the way that we used to do things. And but the way that you put it is much more interesting than the way that I put it. I waffled a little bit there. Sorry about that.
Don't do yourself down, my friend. Don't do yourself down. I think sometimes it's the acoustic power of it as well, because I think sometimes when I hear people sing from cultures that I would have never been aware of, I don't know why I keep mentioning Mongolia, but you think of their traditional throat singing. And I think sometimes, and you look at some of these places in Scotland and in Ireland, some of these historic locations where they were built like 1,500, 2,000 years ago, but they were designed to increase the acoustic powers. And you just kind of think, well, we often look back at peoples of the past and think that they were all sort of hunter-gatherer idiots, which frustrates me intensely, because you cannot have buildings that align with the movements of the sun or the moon and be idiots. I'm sorry, it just doesn't work like that. And you can't build a building in Scotland, up near the top of the country, where you've got these incredible buildings that were designed entirely for acoustic performances, almost as if the building resonates it and makes it go into you even more than through your ears. It's almost as if it pushes into every fibre of your being, Wayne.
Yeah, they weren't built for, aesthetic purposes. They were built for purposes. My ex-wife actually is a singer, and she practiced Mongolian throat warbling. And I used to curse her because she would try it in the morning, and it's not the best way to wake up at times. But she's got a hell of a voice on her, and she's got some range, and you can feel the power. It really hits you, and it catches you. More than just like Christina Aguilera or a Britney Spears, the way that they sing. It kind of demands your attention. I know that's a really cheesy way to describe it, but it's such a powerful way to use your voice that you can see, like you said, if you put somebody with a voice like that in a place like these places where the acoustics are built for it, it can almost feel like a spiritual moment, the way that it just hits you. It doesn't feel like that at 7:30 when you need to get up. But, I've been in concert halls where she sang, and it felt more than just listening to somebody singing. It felt like you were part of it, and it's such a nice but strange feeling to be a part of that. I agree with you. It's more than just coincidences that these places are built, and the alignments are there. There's a definite purpose and a definite thought to this, an understanding of the natural world that a lot of us have unfortunately lost because we're just forced into the 9 to 5 in front of the computer kind of thing. So it's nice that people are getting back into that and rediscovering some of these things, and hopefully people like yourself and me can help people discover some of this stuff and pique people's interests.
Absolutely. Well, as with all of your work, people will always discover wonderful stories, excellent research, with a wonderful dash of historical information in there for their amusement and enjoyment often. And obviously your channel Eerie Edinburgh goes from strength to strength, but now you've obviously got an interesting new project on, where we're going into one of my particularly favourite parts of the paranormal, which is encounters or haunted hospitals, which are, once again, often these seem to be elevated, I think, because of the purpose of the hospital.
Yeah, so I've been in hospitals a few times over my life. Edinburgh has, at the time when I was in them, had very old hospitals. The Royal Infirmary is quite an old building, built on old ground. I once worked a few night shifts in the morgue of the old Royal Edinburgh Hospital, which was an experience. I was working for my stepdad at the time, and I didn't realise what the site that he was putting me on. I was a security guard, and he decided which sites I went in, and I think he did this for a laugh. I walked into the office, and there were still the body chutes there, and hundreds of safety pins lying around the grounds. And I was just like, this must be for pinning people back together after autopsies. But the Royal Edinburgh is the first kind of hospital that I really started to think about. There's something there. I didn't witness anything myself that night. It just felt strange. And I kind of started to think about what people would experience when they were doing night shifts. And then I discovered that one of Edinburgh's most famous hauntings, the Green Lady of Morningside, the murder of the lover happened in the grounds of the hospital, and she's seen in the area of the hospital. I have a friend called Liz who's part of she works with Uncanny and Danny and things like that, and she's a nurse, and she's told me some really interesting accounts that really started me thinking there's quite a lot of stories, quite a lot to this that I could find out more from. One of the stories in the Ireland book, the story associated with Jackie Kennedy, was told to me by a friend, Chrissy, who's a nurse, and she was telling me about some of the experience that some of her colleagues have had that link back to the Royal Edinburgh Hospital. Apparently there's an apparition of a woman in white who's seen on almost a nightly basis. She walks through the main doors out into the courtyard and then disappears. And I was kind of like, I've never heard this story before. You've never told me this story for a start, but I've never read or seen anything about this. So obviously there are stories and accounts that happen. And as soon as I started researching it, all of these stories came out. You just need to go on Reddit and look at some of the haunted hospital stories from across the world. It's difficult to find them in Scotland, but I think I've found about 25 now. And I'm sort of swithering whether to do the stories based on the type of hospital or based on where the hospital is located. I've got loads of stories from Glasgow Infirmary. I've got a few stories from up in Montrose and Aberdeen. I've got a story from Aberdeen where somebody saw a black shape, human-like shape, crawling across a wall towards them. And I've got a very similar story from a care home in Edinburgh where a nurse on her first day was attending somebody who'd just died, and she saw a black shape appear from out the body and then go up onto the ceiling and kind of spread itself flat, and then its tail came down the ceiling and down onto the wall. So again, that's two different locations with two different witnesses, but very similar kind of stories. So I'm not sure whether I want to go with grouping them by location or hospital type or experience type. I guess the more stories that I gather, the easier it will be to decide which approach to go with. People are coming and speaking to me. I've done a couple of posts on like Instagram, and I've put out a wee thing on YouTube asking people to get in touch if they've got any experiences. So I'd really, really like to hear whether you've been a patient or you've worked in a hospital and you've experienced something that you just couldn't explain. Please get in touch. If you want to be included in this series or in the book, I'll give you anonymity. You can name yourself if you want. I don't really mind. It's really up to yourself, but I'd love to hear from people.
Well, I think it's always a fascinating topic because there are so many different scenarios that occur in hospitals, and obviously there's something that have been with us for so many centuries almost, you would say, since we started to care for people, that often there are some buildings that have been there decades and there are some that are quite new, and yet there doesn't seem to be any differential between a new hospital and an old hospital. It would often seem that if the ingredients is correct, or for whatever reason, there will be strange things happen, whether it's that ward's 5 years old or 50 years.
Yeah, and the bulk of the stories that I've found so far are quite, there are a couple that I've mentioned that are quite creepy, very creepy, but most of them are quite reassuring. They are the latest one that I had is from Aberdeen, and it was a couple of witnesses saw a midwife go into the maternity ward, but they recognised it was a midwife who'd worked there previously, didn't work there anymore. And they followed her into the maternity ward, and there was nobody there. Glasgow Infirmary has multiple stories where people are seeing nurses, sisters, that kind of thing. So it feels like these people have that sense of duty, and they carry on that role once they've passed on. And it just feels like they care so much about that role that they can't leave that role. But yeah, some of the stories are from newer hospitals. We've got newer hospitals in Edinburgh. The Western General along the road has numerous stories. The nurses there probably shouldn't have said the name of the hospital, but the nurses are quite reluctant to tell those stories. And then we have the new Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh, and I've had one slightly unusual account come from there, and that's probably 20 years old. It's no more than 25 years old. So we've gone from the old infirmary, which is 200 or 300 years old, to a building that's 2 or 3 decades old, and they both have strange stories.
Yeah. I don't know what it's like in Edinburgh, but obviously Sheffield's one of those cities where we had a lot of regional hospitals in certain different sort of areas. There's 2 or 3 places around here that were specific hospitals in Sheffield, Wayne, where they've been obviously as the main hospitals. So Sheffield has 2, the Hallamshire and the Northern General. And so you get these locations where they become something completely different. And I think there's one here in Sheffield that I know has a haunted history, but it's all wrapped up with both the age of the building and the fact it got bombed during the Second World War. And it's one of those where I think there's a very famous story of a woman who was giving birth, or she was about to go into labour, and they got hit by a bomb, blew everything up, and she ended up delivering her baby under the table where she'd been blown, and they were both fine. But so you have those weird kind of things. But that particular location, and I don't want to mention where that is, that story will connect it anyway. However, that's not a hospital anymore. It's something very different these days. And I wonder if they're still seeing that shadowy figure wandering the halls.
Yeah, so the old Royal Infirmary is now accommodation. And I wonder what happens in there these days. I have a friend, an ex-colleague, who lives in one of the repurposed buildings for the Royal Edinburgh, and she has access to one of the tunnels for where they used to, the staff, the Victorians didn't want the staff or dead bodies to be seen.
Yes.
So her property runs on top of one of the tunnels, and she can get access to it. And she's literally maybe 50 feet from the main house that's associated with the haunting of the Green Lady of Morningside, and the Green Lady is associated with the grounds. So I wonder if she sees anything. She's actually got something quite cool in her property. She's got the original glasswork in the building, and there's a handprint in the glass. You can't scrub it off. You can't feel it. It's like it's inside the glass, and you can see fingerprints, everything. It's a very definite handprint. It's a woman's handprint. It's a very small hand. I've seen it, and I've put my hand up to it, and it dwarfs. My hand dwarfs this hand, which in my head obviously goes to that was the hand of the Green Lady of Morningside, Lady Elphinstone, but clearly it wasn't. It's probably just something that happened in the manufacturing process, but it's a great story that's kind of just brings it to life a wee bit for me. But yeah, I'm sure there's these things happen in these properties. I would love to hear from people who maybe live in some of these properties that have been repurposed from hospitals into accommodation now. I'm sure there's stuff going on.
I can't wait till you start pulling those together for our enjoyment and entertainment. So, as always, my friend, where can everybody follow your channel, keep up to date, send you a story, and get hold of some of your wonderful books, my man?
Well, you'll find me on YouTube, just under Eerie Edinburgh. I have the website, eerieedinburgh.com. I'm on Blue Sky, on Instagram, still on Twitter. And I am on Facebook. I don't go on Facebook that often, but just search for Eerie Edinburgh, and I'll probably be the first one to come up.
Well, I'll put links as always in the show notes for everybody to track you down, and hopefully send you some spooky experiences that you can share with us down the line. And as always, thank you again. Thank you for offering me the opportunity to write the foreword for Hidden Haunts Island. It was an honour to write for somebody whose work I appreciate and enjoy so much. And I wish you all the very best, and I can't wait till our next conversation, my friend.
Thank you, sir. The foreword was the best part of the book, by far.
Oh. Now I'm blushing, and I don't do that. Take care.
Thank you, Paul.